Jean, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really delightful to be here, share a few moments. Before turning it over to Özge, I'm just going to focus on, provide more context for the political histories and also theorizing about the dead fast, which I'm going to focus on the more time-based representations, thinking about that sort of work of representing, and our film collaboration based on Özge's research is caught up with both of those. So to start with, I'm going to share just a little clip from our film as a reference point.
Siyasi tutsaklar toplu halde yaşıyorduk. Toplu halde en az bir 20 kişi, 30 kişinin birlikte yaşadığı, her şeyi paylaştığı, kolektif bir yaşam kurduğu bir biçim vardı. Aynı zamanda dışarıda bağlarımız her yönüyle çok güçlüydü. İstediğimiz yayınları alabiliyorduk, istediğimiz kitapları alabiliyorduk ve görüşlerde bir problem yaşamıyorduk. Bizi görmek isteyen ailemiz dışında da herkes gelebiliyordu, görüş yapabiliyorduk. Saatleri de kısıtlı ve sınırlı değildi. Bundan kaynaklı da çok iç içelik, içeri ve dışarıda çok iç içelik vardı ve yaşam içeride de dışarıdaki gibi devam ediyordu. Hem düşünsel anlamda hem de ruhsal anlamda böyle bir yanı vardı. Ama 19 Aralık sonrasında insanlar doğal yaşamlarından, insanca yaşam olan topluluk içerisinde yaşam olan doğal yaşamlarından kopartılıp tek başlarına hücrelere atıldılar. En fazla 3 kişi dedi.
Aslında sorun tutsaklar arasından sonra biraz burada başlıyor. Yani size tamamen dışarıdan kafadan yalıtan bir şey var. Sistem var, mekanizma var. Bu mekanizma sizin önünüzde bir sürü duvar örüyor. Önce fiziki duvarlar örüyor. Sizin dışarıya erişiminizi engelliyor. Gözünüzün gördüğü her yerde yalnızca duvarlarla karşılaşıyorsunuz. Gözünüz çok fazla öteyi göremiyor. Duvarın dışında bir şey göremiyor. Ama bunun yanında işte sistemin, hapishane sisteminin, kapatılma sisteminin size getirdiği diğer şeyler. İşte mektuplarınızın sürekli okunuyor olması, denetleniyor olması. Fethi'de hapishanelerde mesela en fazla 3 kişiyle sürekli görüşüyor olabilmeniz. Sizinle sürekli bir şekilde yüz yüze gelebilen gardiyanlarla bir iletişiminizin çok sınırlı tutulması. Herhangi bir görevliyle mesela gardiyanda eğer şey olursanız, yeterinden fazla samimi olursanız o gardiyan bir daha göremeyecek olursunuz. Ya da herhangi bir gardiyanla ciddi bir gerginlik yaşadıysanız o gardiyanı yine bir daha göremeyecek olursunuz.
So time is mediated by processes of perception and cognition, technology and culture, established precedents, and shifting contextualization. And any representation of time, and with it, individual human subjectivity and group ideologies or behaviors are caught up with different overlapping palimpsests or learnings of mediation. All is mediation. There is no immediate. Any present now is already instantly past, faster than we can think, much less say or point to. The future is entirely unknown, and the past is relegated to surging and ebbing reservoirs of memory, themselves constantly buffeted by newer input. The corrupting stimuli and the fading, misfiring apparatus of recollection. And yet, we must use the mediating channels, distillations and distortions of language, image, and metaphor to sense and express those very impressions. Without words for past or future, would they even exist? Even the smallest recognition of linguistic or cultural relativism opens the door to realizing time as a construct. Thomas Mann pointed to the strangely physical basis used to measure the abstract and physical, psychological realm of time, the tracking of the flick of a clock's second hand in space, or more minutely, the jump of an electron from one trajectory to another, a translation from one dimension of abstract perception to another of material reality, or vice versa. Time-based multimedia representations, not only of people and things as objects, but of abstractions such as subjectivity, ideology, and time itself, have become naturalized even as media-specific contexts and conventions for production, distribution, and reception have modulated ceaselessly. The strivings to represent ethnograpically for moving images and sound, that is, human portraits in film and video, have been constrained by technical actualities, heavy equipment, limited storage capacities, challenges in processing and formatting their final outcomes, but also by social expectations around both reception and production. What does it do to group dynamics, even among those who are familiars, much more strangers, when a bulky, highly manufactured recording apparatus enters into their midst and dominates physical and social proceedings and individual attention? What kinds of extra degrees of inhibitory self-consciousness does it provoke among those it attempts to document? Meanwhile, the focused act of watching and listening to moving images and recordings of sound entails entering and sustaining relationships with a particularly modern series of unfolding representations of others, most often or most effectively taking place in the dark. Placing ourselves in the dark is immersing in a material condition significant beyond the practical basis for allowing projected light images to contrast more sharply in our fields of vision and the sounds broadcast to command our attention. By putting ourselves in obscure rooms, the camera of designated viewing chambers, think theaters, lecture halls, and living rooms or bedrooms, these other ends of the porthole that starts with the camera of the image capturing device, we willingly cross boundaries, the entrance of liminal borders, to immerse ourselves in ritual space and undergo the triggering transformations, or at least approach an emulation of hypnagogic and hallucinatory states, manufactured dream worlds that inform and influence our further sensibilities long after we turn our attention away from the screen. The recording camera is a ritual space as well, framing and setting aside experience to incite a shift in attitude and behavior in relation to it, and further transformations of understanding that experience. The capturing of moments of time through the late modern recording devices, the further manipulation of those captured elements and the projection of them, and I use projection here to both the psychological as well as the physical sense, generates generous possibilities and prolific possible misunderstandings. One misunderstanding is that seeing or hearing is equivalent to knowing. Through film and video, their purported mimetic disruption and disposition, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that any moving, talking images are a series of individual still frames, an encoded, decoded simulacra of originally produced sound, most frequently somewhere between 20 and 30 single frames per second, each one encapsulating lifetimes and universes. Thoughts, emotions, impressions proliferate and crowd one another out, impelling the consciousness of both producer and viewer. Apparent transparency tricks us with a magical force, causing us to believe that what we are seeing is a recording of reality, lacking only what's off-frame and what goes on in the minds of those captured as images and sound. Trained through conventions of montage and continuity to interpret any series of single image frames as a cohering document of unfolding past actualities, whatever sounds may synchronize or not synchronize, we forget the Zeno's paradox of intermediate expressions that pass over those figures we track and those postures that they pass through. The emergence of seeming actuality presented by so-called observational cinema, framed scenes of human life allowed to unfold over relatively longer durations without the disruptions of frequent scene changes, but also more pointed visual or auditory intervening formal devices, have dominated most cinema through a now not-so-brief history of ethnographic representation. As one exemplar of the willful and steady gaze upon documented human subjects, we might contemplate the work of Belgian filmmaker Chantal Ackerman, who is not averse to staging scenes while continuing to straddle the realism pursued in documentary's most observational modes. Through a process of accumulation, Ackerman generates a group portrait testifying to various levels of engagement with a contemporary world by sprawling into a sort of extended or dilated temporality. What coheres and remains through a cumulative record of ordinariness is a sense of always elusive truths on the brink, with occasional, more startling reveals. But more compelling is the making clear that we don't know what we don't know. The withholding of words spoken by her subjects, for instance, leaves us to guess or imagine. In her 1975 film, Jean Dielman, 23 Près du Commerce, Ackerman highlights what happens mostly off-screen while foregrounding the mundane tasks of the film's protagonist, a middle-class bourgeois single mother who also happens to be a prostitute. I'm going to share a brief moment from a clip of that. Scene, unnarrated, static camera, using the ambient sound from the scene itself, and it's fairly typical of this more than 2-hour-long film. In her 1983 film, Death, she similarly offers up portraits of people in domestic spaces before they emerge to become constituents among crowds of anonymous groups on public streets, walking, shopping, waiting for a tram in the dark, cold of a winter night, which happens to be on the cusp of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The effects of this cataclysmic change on people's lives is left uncertain, but in a long tracking shot, the gathering of the difficult-to-interpret expressions from face after face and the postures of body after waiting body evokes a combined sense of stoicism and vulnerability. I'll share a little bit of that one. In an ideal cinematic space, we have the lights out and windows curtained. That helps. Thank you.
Do you want them to stay up?
You can turn it back on if it's okay. Thank you. So while avoiding the complicated implications of a tracking or moving dolly shot, as in the scene you just saw from Ackerman's film, in Death Fast, our film, Özge Serin and I employed a series of scenes from everyday life in the streets of Istanbul to accumulate a sense of extended or dilated time or times in the daily, mostly anonymous existence of lives lived. One technique is adapted from notions of this sort of observational cinema. But a complicated set of questions and responses opens up to any purist notion of so-called observational cinema once one consciously enters into the compositing of images and sound. Questions about each choice, not only who to portray, how to frame, what to capture in initial recording, but also questions of editing, the placing of one scene next to another, and how long to let each one last, what voiceover or other sounds to add or overlap. And all this implies considerations of more aggressive manipulations of the image and sound representations. What advantage might be gained in representation itself by more willfully and radically interrupting and actively deconstructing any set of media resources and recordings. Any representation is not only filled with information, but haunted by the ghosts of withheld information. As one intervention in a straightforward representation following modes of a purely observational cinema, in our film, Death Fast, we chose to envelop the figures of our primary speaking subjects with an obscuring white gauzy film, a film over a film, curtaining and filtering and distancing those figures from us. And you saw some examples of that in the first clip that I showed. This imposition or overlay of a semi-translucent, semi-opaque filter makes ghostly the apparitions of the individuals we are portraying, while they are allowed to speak fully to the camera, withholding of visual information. The absence of full visibility reminds of our structural positions as both producers and viewers of representations. Impossible to get close enough to inhabit the actual space of direct experience for those being imaged, much less the full range of impacts they undergo via ideological influences and constructs, and impacts from their own intervening shifts over time. As another exemplar of a filmmaker at a seemingly conceptual opposing end of the spectrum from the observational cinema, New York-based filmmaker Ken Jacobs radically suspends and disrupts the framed space, such as in his Ghetto Fish Market, 1903, in which he manipulates found footage taken from a century or more ago to highlight small gestures of individuals within each frame, calling attention to behaviors and attitudes that might otherwise go unobserved in the conventionally smooth and continuous streaming of single image frame after single image frame. And as one last example, I'm going to show you a little bit from the Fish Market. And actually, could I trouble someone to just the participation part of this for me? Stop there. So though an art film, I think in Jacob's work has a lot to say about, a deconstruction of conventional modes of montage, questioning media representations that maybe most of us have come to take for granted, and thus not only a lot to say about documentary, but a different form of documenting prior realities or actualities. So these flickering interruptions have the paradoxical effect of refocusing the eye and the mind on particular elements inside the frame and outside it as well. What we see is not all of what we can get, or at least aspire to reach. The ambit of any figure's journey implies itself beyond the twitches and gestures beheld in any image frame. The conflicting thoughts and emotions they experience continue to fire inside beyond what they are able to speak. What is caught up in those thoughts and emotions and experience that is also elided in the straightforward rendering through images and words are social relations and understandings. These are different crucial truths which can be sensed through the cracks in the momentum processes of moving image production and apprehension themselves. And further, such disruptions to conventional modes of presenting film images as a never-ending stream, no matter the montage techniques such as quick jump cuts in place and time, breaks a sort of fourth wall in filming and in viewing films, where the illusion of the camera as a simple prosthetic or extension of human vision becomes taken for granted and invisible. For our part in Death Fast, we attempt to intervene in any easy acceptance of a sort of realism through multiple disruptive techniques. The ghostly filter already mentioned and shown for much of the interview portions of the films, but also multiple overlapping image exposures playing out in alternation or vying for attention, short repeated loops of imagery inviting viewers to consider details of different scenes unfolding and conjecture as to the positions, trajectories, and motivations of those portrayed in such scenes, highly fragmented portions of an extremely cropped frame, as we also saw in the opening clip, to highlight individual figures and actions within that frame, following some of the examples in the last clip we just saw of Panjaga's manipulations, and highlighting within a scene or a frame. And then also repeated quick flashes, interrupting a more static image of one of the Death Fasters, hinting at the haunting of his own memory basis for consciousness and identity, coming as a consequence of the hunger strike's effect on his brain and mentation. If not the quote, view from everywhere, unquote, that Merleau-Ponty posits through so-called excess of vision, the multiply intervened upon images compelled a new set of relationships for image producers and image viewers of representations, which are not meant to simply correspond with any objective tableau. Rather, they offer partial glimpses of variable human subjects whose own unseen motivations and actions are without question more complex, along with any group they might be affiliated with. Our film Death Fast then attempts to negotiate a range of different tensions between the realism of observational cinema and ethnographic filmmaking, while directing the attention of viewers to the very means of the film's making itself, and the representational attempt in ethnographic film overall. Thank you very much.
So the film emerged from my long-term fieldwork in Turkey. So I'm going to give a snippet from that ethnography and read back and forth between a critical theoretical reading of the Death Fast and the narratives of the Death Fasters. So the anonyms which populate my talk are also in the film as ghostly figures. So I'm going to also try to give a depth to their storytelling. So my talk is titled In the Place of Madness, the Time of the Death Fast and the Political, and it has 3 sections. The first section is called The Secret, the second section is called The Labor of Living, and the third section is After. I met R in December 2006, almost a year before the end of what would be a 2,286-day hunger strike come death fast among political prisoners contesting the regime of isolation in Turkey's newly instituted F-type high-security prisons. The war between the revolutionary left and the Turkish state had moved from the street to the prison since the 1980 military coup and the subsequent junta, resulting in the emergence of hunger strikes and death fasts as a key tactic of resistance against state repression, with a strategic value extending beyond the immediate institutional boundaries of the prison. The military junta administered the prison as a spatially limited territory in which it enclosed revolutionary captives in an absolute war of subjectivity. that aimed not only at vanquishing but also at converting the internal enemies of the state through the disciplinary exercise of the power of life and death in the very service of political desubjectivation and Turkification. So it was in direct response to the disciplinary exercise of the power of life and death, which often exceeded any social, economic, or political functionality of the state's repressive power, that the revolutionary left and Kurdish prisoners radicalized the hunger strike to a struggle to death, marked in the distinction between hunger strike, açlık grevi, and dead fast, ölüm orucu. The choice of death for freedom as a defiant alternative to the ignominy attached to actual penal servitude and eventual political subjection imbued the death fast with a messianism, which authorized the destruction of the body, qua servile thing, as the condition of possibility for the advent of freedom. R was introduced to me as one of the heroes of the prison resistance, despite his ongoing tumultuous separation from the outlawed Marxist-Leninist organization, Revolutionary Communist League of Turkey. One among a plethora of radical left organizations that originated in the revolutionary movement of the 1970s, persisted through a long period of retreat marked by the crisis of Marxism and neoliberal militarism and authoritarian statism, and continue to find their bearings in a political conjuncture defined by the ascendancy of Islamist and Kurdish movements. He was a survivor of the 1996 death fast, which was instigated by Justice Minister Mehmet Ağar's series of circulars authorizing the incarceration of new convicts and detainees in the special type Eskişehir prison, which was the forerunner of the F-type prisons in 2000. So since at least the opening of Metris E-type prison in 1981, the Turkish state systematically attempted to dissolve and destroy the autonomous enclaves that revolutionary captives had carved out in the new strategic trench of prison, constructing communism in the here and now through resistant forms of cooperation and sociality. Their hunger strikes and death fasts serially forestalled transfer to cell-type prisons in 1991, 1994, and 1996, until the prison operation returned to life when the armed forces entered into 20 prisons across the country with bulldozers, drills, and bombs in the early morning of December 19, 2000, ostensibly to reoccupy prisons and save the hunger strikers. Instead of ending the hunger strike on its 61st day, the immediate and brutal transfer of prisoners to various F-type prisons, some which were still partially under construction, constitute an essential turning point in the prison resistance. So the different means of resistance, such as the hunger strikes of limited and unlimited duration, converged into a collective death fast and spread to 41 prisons across the country. So at its peak after the prison operation, the number of its participants ranged between 1,500 to 2,000. So kind of like a general hunger strike in all prisons across the country. By late 2005, early 2006, just as I was beginning fieldwork, the ending of the death fast had, in a sense, already taken place. The prison movement had cast itself down into a state of suspension, overwriting its demand with a stumbling rhythm of perseverance and paralysis. On May 28, 2002, 2.5 years later, all the participating prison organizations had withdrawn from the death fast, with the exception of the Revolutionary People's Liberation Party Front and the Communist Labor Party of Turkey. The former organization was still launching new teams, though with fewer death fasters and at greater intervals. The latter had run out of its entire reserve of prisoners because the state authorities had begun to discharge, starting in May 2001, a large number of death fasters on the grounds of their debilitating health conditions. The readiness of the authorities temporarily to postpone the execution of the sentences of the detainees and grant presidential pardon for the convicts in their maneuver to prevent the escalation of deaths inside prisons, since the series of deaths in April had at the very least the effect of destabilizing the prison resistance and hastening its demise. So 660 prisoners were discharged by October 2004, and this counter tactic of the state authorities had as its paradoxical outcome the expansion of the communication between prisoners and society at large. The more the prison resistance lost its public visibility, the more the dead fasters became accessible outside carceral surveillance, giving rise to the possibility of my fieldwork, but also over-determining its central problem. The extraordinarily long duration of the dead fast, the scandalous indifference of the prison movement to the instrumental logic of politics, laid bare the rift between the space of dying and the space of politics, the distinction that one might thematize as the difference between the endurance of the dead faster and the duration of the political act, and pose the question of the excess of the dead fast. So the secret. When we spoke alone at his workplace on a cold December morning, a legal office where he was answering phones by day and sleeping in a back room at night, R told me a secret which he had not, and indeed could not divulge to his deathbed attendants and companions. On the 37th day of the dead fast, while even those whose existent infirmities and ailments had prepared everyone for their early debilitation were still on their feet, R had become bedridden, completely unable to stand up and walk. What his comrades could not see was that he had passed into a different mode, a transformation he kept secret and which took him to what could only be described, he said, as a place of madness. He lay in bed with his arms and legs immobilized, his eyes blinded by light, covered with pads, and his ears plugged with cotton because even the most minute sound exploded in them. In this place of madness, he had a very peculiar experience. While Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony played inside his head, he became a firefighter brigade during the Nazi siege of Leningrad. Bombs were exploding in my head, fire engines were going right and left. I began to think that I was going crazy. This peculiar experience underwent a further inflection when he began to live everything that was recounted to him with extraordinary conscientiousness by his comrades about the textile workers striking in Ünaltı, Gaziantep. I didn't know Ünaltı, but I happened to have gone there when they were telling me about it. And he's using here this differential past tense in Turkish, which I can say later. Really, I was no longer lying in a bed in one of the cells of the ward C3 on the second floor of Bayrampaşa prison. I was in Antep and there were factories and workshops around me. The workers were mostly young people and I was in a struggle with them. We were fighting against the gendarmes and it was as if the bludgeons were really landing on me. End of quote. He rejoiced in his new resource before which all difficulties and hindrances to movement fell away. And he began to picture himself in different libraries. And then R's consciousness outside himself sought for itself the openness of squares, which in their very emptiness called forth crowds of people. And somewhere in the thick of the crowd stood R possessed by their event. Quote, I saw myself at Plaza del Mayo, Concord, Trafalgar, Central Park, Tiananmen, Taksim, Kızılay, and Konak. At first there was no one but me, and I was walking around, and then I was merging with thousands of people. I had the sensation that I was capable of doing anything. I begin with R's account, neither merely fictional nor simply non-fictional, because he enabled me to apprehend the form of thinking in the dead fast by effecting a perspectival shift. Drawing on an evidentiary paradigm, the readings of the hunger strike as a meta-juridical trial endowed the suffering body and ultimately the corpse with the ability to testify truthfully to carceral violence and thereby indict state power by shaming it in the eyes of a public jury. The indexical relation of the body to the violence enacted upon it is deemed to provide an unmediated access to the hidden abode of counter-law with capillary sites of power, which is disclosed in its corporeal effects. But the double meaning contained in the word exposure, as both truth-telling and denunciation, teşhir in Turkish, proves to be operatic in that the body of evidence, rather than serving as a mirror in the service of truth and legal justice, assumes the function of screen instead. Behind what is shown in the suffering body, not merely out of sight, but necessarily invisible, is sovereign power, cited there as an absent presence. R activates an averse perspective, the perspective from the place of madness, by challenging our own spectatorship and inviting us to see the same body as a space of open potentiality for forming new connections and assemblages of bodies, not the possibility of this or that body or bodies, but possibility as such. For this open potentiality to insist at the limits of the lived body, R himself must dissolve, must disperse into a multitude of bodies that are fighting their own battles. His hunger must take leave of his body, part with what it was, to become something else, to be transposed, transmitted, or translated into something else, to defeat the life-denying forces. It must become an impersonal event. In his seminal ethnography on the Irish hunger strike, Ellen Feldman argues that the reciprocal acts and reenactments of violence between antagonistic forces transform the body into both the product effect and an instrument of violence, the weapon artifact. In his account, agency inheres in identification with the dominator and mimesis of his violence to the end of reversing the relations of domination. Yet the reversal of these relations of domination partakes in the very same relations it denounces, and Feldman ethnography finds itself dramatizing the circular logic by which all objects of violence end up becoming, by dialectical reversal, subjects of violence. Though Feldman contests desubjectivation as absolute sovereign effect, essentially instrumental, his notion of subjectivization of power as exteriority depends upon the bifurcation of the self and the active objectification of the body as an instrument of violence in a desire for the proper body and proper body politics. Accordingly, he construes the 1981 Irish hunger strike as a deadly purification of the self, a sacrificial expulsion of state violence by means of eating the very body that has become infested with it. In other words, consuming the enemy by consuming the self. Similarly, Barbu's reading of the Dead Fast is organized largely by the same topology of inversion, taken in the first instance from Feldman's Lacouchian weaponization of the body, and displaced in such a way that the weaponization of life comes to signify the sacrifice of life in the name of political being that would in the end be worth more than biological life. Insofar as the hunger strike remains modeled on the usurpation of the power of life and death, it remains within the fold of the sovereign subject and reenacts the sovereign gesture of banishing bare life as that which must be accepted, so that human life is actively brought forth, albeit in a new form, from life which is neither human nor inhuman. I argue contra Feldman and Barbu that dead fasters do not become properly alive and more and perhaps most human, but to the contrary, less proper and more impersonal. I contend that the dead fast becomes truly disruptive in the sense that it decisively renders inoperative the biopolitical and juridical dispositive of the sovereign subject, when we pay close attention to the double structure of death without diminishing the force of death to its willful embodiment, my death, my time, my decision, or as William Haber felicitously named it, the body of this death. So Gilles Deleuze, borrowing from the distinct vocabulary of Maurice Blanchot's space of literature, offers death as the ultimate example of the event in order to mark its double structure. Death, quote, death and its wound are not simply events, among other events. Every event is like death, double, and impersonal in its double. Death, and death corporealizes itself only in singular bodies, yet it always exceeds all its possible corporealizations. Every event like death never realizes or accomplishes itself fully. It always exceeds all its material effectuations and bodily incarnations. And freedom consists in releasing this radical potentiality, a potential too, where the infinitive is not governed by anything that already is actual. So releasing this radical potentiality from lived corporeal bodies at the risk of destroying them. Death fasters recuperate this potentiality. What is it to live? In the very site where the potentiality for relations and possibilities of life and experience have been severely contracted, if not exhausted, to the organic time of biological life, by a techno-bureaucratic machine that seeks to organize every detail of daily life with minimal contact, so that nothing takes place except a mere willing that lives to maintain itself. There are, and always, at least two hungers, two deaths, which function according to different rhythms, different temporalities, and different logics on the death fast. Though the two hungers do not exist in isolation, their heterogeneity and the distance and the interval that disjoin them make them non-contemporaneous with each other. While one hunger pushes the body towards its limit, where the organic time of possibility that is determined and ordered in advance by death dissipates itself into vegetative state, the other at the same limit opens to the contretemps of potentiality, when the past and the future become indeterminate and open, delaying the closure the political domain already seems to have reached, and thus outliving itself. It is imperative in death fasting that the interval between the two hungers, the two deaths, must not be resolved or equalized, and that this interval of dissymmetry and discord that passes between these two hungers, two deaths, must itself be maintained. Death fasters are thus drawn, or draw themselves toward death, at the same time as they are constantly drawn back to life. The coincidence of a priori perfect and infinitive of death is never accomplished. Or if it's accomplished in some sense, that is, if they are able to hold themselves in this in-between, we must conceive this endurance as a non-sovereign becoming which gives time, abolishing and prolonging it at once, the instant of death that does not pass. 2, the labor of living. So, in our conversation after our release from the prison in the summer of 2006, F described death fasting as a form of political action which extends itself in time. First, she made the point that the death fasters desire to win piece by piece, and then in seeming contradiction with herself, she continued to say that they desire to win every single moment. This temporal dichotomy between the piecemeal accomplishment of the act and the momentous fulfillment of its ends did not engender a questioning of the distance that already separated the death fasters from their addressees. It served rather to repeat and enact in what she advanced as the message of life in death fasting. Quote, I'm taking the risk of dying for my ends, for my demands. I can die at any moment, but if you concede my demands, I can also return to life immediately. End quote. Despite appearances to the contrary, then, death fasting gave prominence to life by delaying the advent of death. Quote, you undertake this form of struggle, reckoning that the longer you stay alive, the greater your chances of winning. End quote. Understood in this way, death fasting had in fact little to do with self-dissipation. On the contrary, it was a productive consumption of life forces, which aimed to bring forth a different form of existence, by refusing to live under the conditions in the F-type prisons. According to F, it was the F-type prisons which were the very site of consumption proper, or unproductive consumption, where they would waste away bit by bit, inconspicuously, not unlike the cumulative consumptions of lives of surplus value extraction outside the prison. The decay of the prisoner was the same as the exhaustion of the laborer who had to work more than her body could bear, only to survive the conditions of existence. There was a hidden link between political violence and economic exploitation, and F compared the dead fast to the proletarian strike by conflating the interruption of... The microphone wants me to stop. Okay.
It's on.
Okay. There was a hidden link between political violence and economic exploitation, and F compared the dead fast to the proletarian strike by conflating the interruption of social production with that of individual reproduction on the basis of a common interest in the betterment of material conditions of reproduction. She contended that workers whose lives are consumed with new coercive measures every day begin to struggle for better life conditions when they turn off the power switches to finish with that kind of labor in which their lives are wasted and gesture towards other forms of existence which may be beginning at this very moment. The longer one lasted on the dead fast, the higher was the possibility of returning to life under better conditions. She acknowledged the possibility of death, but she added that she would still have won life for the survivors, just like the striking workers who might not have been allowed to return to the factory, but who would have changed the working conditions for all future workers. It was neither a personal gain nor an organizational one, but rather a gain for the social. In identifying the physiological consumption of the body with its social consumption, both of which are measured by the general equivalent of abstract time, F conflates the relations of domination with relations of exploitation in the interest of suspending the consumption of the body for the expansion of capital and consolidation of state power. In so doing, she determines its use in accordance with the ends of a renewed social. The interruption of individual reproduction interrupts the realization of the reproduction of social relations within the prison, and which is already transformed into a site of ideological struggle by political organizations. An invitation to undertake a similar act in institutions outside the prison, dead fast is narrativized here as an act in which an enduring body refuses to be used and used up by capital and state power alike, and becomes a radical space of experimentation and imagination regarding the relation to social surplus. In this sense, perseverance is both the message and the necessary personal quality to give time to the exploited others outside the prison to read this very message. Crucially, however, this imperative of perseverance transformed living into a more difficult task than dying. In this narrative, life and death were not absolute opposites. Rather, they blended with each other to such a degree that the ability to die turned into a luxury. S would not attempt in vain to expose the true face of the Turkish state by dying, since dying in such a way she would have entrenched, without willing it, the myth of the invincibility of the Turkish state ever more deeply into a world which was already marked by the signs of its violence. It was far more threatening, as she put it, to keep the Turkish state beside itself by living on for one more day. They were struggling to stay alive, and it was no exaggeration to say that for them the labor of living was more demanding than dying. Quote, "We had to drink 6 liters of water to remain alive. It was such a torture to drink 6 liters of water every day. Compared with this, dying is very easy." End quote. According to S, they attempted something more essential than simply the task of dying. Instead, they pushed themselves to the limit of their endurance by fighting with death with persistence. From this view, an easy death was not permissible. It was supposed to be an unrelenting battle in which one was not to surrender the struggle, even if it were to end in death. In a prose poem arrayed from letters written by dead fasters to each other, the model of this merciless fight was figured by a commanding anonymous voice as the Battle of Stalingrad, with its memorable floor-by-floor close quarters combat in the city's apartment blocks, factories, warehouses, and office buildings. Quote, "You will not surrender a single cell, a single muscle, without fighting like in the Battle of Stalingrad, street to street, house to house, room to room." End of quote. Extending the battle lines into every point of contact, they were then able to bring death and life out of infinite distance into infinite proximity. The consequences here were dramatic, for such intimacy with death paradoxically vanished death. The most commendable fight took the form of ignoring or forgetting about death to the point of living as if one were not bound by time. C confessed that he had never thought of death but always of living and winning during his 220 days on the death fast. Unlike the dead fasters from other organizations who were waiting to die, they had not assigned themselves any number of days. For his comrades and him to approach death, or better to be approached by death, was to confront the limitless limit of the indeterminable. Quote, "Nobody could believe that we could go beyond our hundreds and 200s by only drinking liquids. We had presumed that deaths would begin to occur serially on the 60th and 70th. But people did not die till much later. After the hundreds, we stopped keeping track of the days. If we had survived our hundreds, we could have survived even more. We stopped thinking that we would be bedridden. We no longer had any day limitations on our minds." End of quote. Instead of desiring to die quickly, Y and her comrades were driven to push themselves to their limits, and in the process, they had also exposed themselves to the limitlessness that lay within them. By redirecting all their attention to life, which they were resolved to continue in its former state. It was important for them to continue with their ordinary life because they sought to impose measures on this long-term struggle with death, involving paths which repeatedly called into question their initial resolve by so many dilemmas, so many sideways turnings or failings. Their prison life was already organized by a self-imposed penitential discipline, one which had acquired a new vigor with the death fast, as if they were frightened that dying would free them from all discipline and restraint, abandoning them to one of the most dissolute of powers. They didn't need to wake up at 6 in the morning for exercise and breakfast as they were used to do in the past. They would have slept in, yet they still took the trouble of waking up at the same hour. Instead of breakfast, they now drank their water mixed with sugar and salt, which had become completely natural, like eating 3 times a day. It was as though, he said self-bewilderedly, they had been living this way since the day they were born. The only difference was that they were spending hardly any time on the reproduction of biological life itself, which had stolen precious time away from them unawares within the endless circuit of daily preparation and consumption of food. Once eating was eliminated from their daily activities, they had accrued a surplus of time which had allowed them to freely develop their full potential and to experience, as he put it, an unprecedented degree of productivity and creativity. So each, in their own way, on multiple occasions, dramatized the progression of the death fast in terms of a limitless self-transcendence beyond the endless circular movement of simple self-reproduction. They had read profusely, studied subjects from quantum physics, geometry, to philosophy and foreign languages, and written numerous articles, petitions, and letters. According to these accounts, the death fast had revealed such measureless possibilities that they felt as if they did not have enough time to realize all of them. Transported by his memories, C declared from a temporal distance without heeding the contradiction in his words, which did not give way to a dialectical synthesis. Quote, "On the death fast, you rediscovered life and everything." So I'm just going to end now. Instead of increasing its forces with a constantly expanding transversal multiplicity and therewhere dividing itself and changing nature, the prison movement drifted towards its eventual dissolution, leaving in its ruins a crippled political subject without futurity. Once valiant fighters to death, the survivors now suffered from Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, an irreversible damage of the brain brought about by the depletion of tiny vitamin B1. The strange affliction manifested itself in the ataxic gait of the survivors, and some could not even walk on their own due to a vertiginous imbalance. And when it was not restricted to a pure Wernicke's disease, and it hardly ever was, it assumed the form of an enduring amnesia, Korsakoff psychosis. They could not recognize people they had met, places they had been, conversations they had held, emotions they had felt across an indefinite lapse of time, though they had the sensation of having seen, having been, having spoken, having felt. The past did not return as a present, or more properly speaking, the past returned, but to immure the present in its absence. The presence of the absence of the past made the present a repeated opening to time and space, which did not give itself as a world, but as a world always already at its ending, whereby awakening to consciousness was experienced as a perpetual recapitulation of death and as a rebirth. A punishment, in I's words, much more iniquitous than a death sentence. Quote. The authorities thought that they could end the death fast with medical intervention, and especially with improper medical intervention. If you die, it serves my purpose. But if you don't die and become like this, it serves my purpose even better. I'm not killing, I will not kill, I will not let you die, but I will make it much worse than dying. You're going to die every day. Every time you wake up, you will be born again. It is something for someone to die once. It is completely something else to be born again and die again every single day. The same thing starts over and over again. End of quote. Though the ethico-political task of the critique of violence in Benjamin's terms is to disrupt, displace, and alter the instituted protocols of readability of violence by turning the critique itself into an inseparable part of the event that the critique does not represent but puts into play. The critique challenges and loosens, perhaps even severs, the conventional links rather than confirming their authority between the experience of death and those grammars which purport to represent and politicize it. It's only when the critique makes audible by making visible the forms of life, relation to time and to the body, and practices that materialize in the place of madness, that the death fast might acquire the interpretive force to explode its own limits, reconfiguring the field of politics and redistributing the possibilities of life. Only then the vegetative body will not resemble the life it liberates, dying will not resemble the life-denying forces it negates, hunger will not resemble the future it makes possible. Thank you. It's a bit too long. I also have some photographs, but I can talk about them during the Q&A.
Thank you so much. We will open it up to questions. I know some folks may have to go, but we would love to get some questions. Elisa?
Hi, it's phenomenal. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so curious about so many parts of the film. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you brought the camera apparatus into this situation and what that was like. And in some ways, for me, I'm thinking about the film and the corpse and the relationship between like this space, this act of shaming that can happen in the presence of it. And so I don't know if the purpose of the film was to produce that shame or to show authorities that shame, or if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, yeah. I mean, so the film shooting happened in 2009 and 2010. So at that time, the death fast had already come to an end. So we didn't actually shoot people on the death fast, but we interviewed with people who were on the death fast. And I started talking to them in early 2005. So I already had kind of very solid relationships with them. But even then, the entrance of the camera into their social space was troubling in the sense that they had to consult with their organizations and organizational command before they talked to us on the camera. So when they talked to me, they didn't have to get that kind of permission. But when we decided to film them, like there was this maybe 2 or 3 week delay in their response where they had to discuss. I don't know if that, I mean, so that there was no starving bodies that we were trying to film. And actually another point that I should make that those kinds of images were not circulated in the public sphere in Turkey, which is very different, I think, than the US and elsewhere. So, I mean, I know that the organizations themselves filmed, like this one particular organization, the leading organization, filmed the entire Dead Fast because maybe it wasn't there after their release. Those 2 organizations continued with their Dead Fast in these resistance houses. So in those resistance houses, so they were among their own constituencies. And so during that time, that was filmed, and all of that film was shipped somewhere to Europe. Like it didn't stay in the country.
Maybe it's worth adding that we thought about how phenomenologically impossible it is to represent a starving body, that the time duration it takes is so protracted that there's no way you can really, I mean, we can certainly frame the emaciation, gauntness, but the actual time-based experience they were undergoing, you couldn't do a one-for-one correspondence with in film. Worth mentioning in a sort of technical point, since you brought up the apparatus in response to maybe what I had said earlier, the camera we were using at the time was like a old school film or television broadcast camera. It wasn't like a smaller handheld that newer digital means has allowed. So its physical presence was kind of undeniable in a way that was maybe smaller handheld devices could be more casual. The last point I'll mention to add on to what Özge said is that there were 2 sets of her
Interlocutor.
yes, the consultants that separated, that there was several who remained part of the organization, and we met in that social space designated by the organization for their sort of community gathering. But there was also a couple disaffected or, I don't know, apostate or exiled in some
I mean,
ways.
like actually this event ended up dissolving these organizations too because of the wounding that happened, and some of it is in the film. We narrated in the film. So there were a lot of their members at the time, like they were kind of quitting, separating themselves from the organization. I mean, not that they gave up on their political convictions or activities, but it's just like they were no longer members of these particular organizations.
So the ones that stayed inside the organization, we interviewed inside their organizational space, and the having to consult with the organization for approval to interview with us was part of their experience and our experience interacting. The ones who were no longer part of the organization, we interviewed not only outside that organizational space, but literally outside in a kind of neutral public space. And their response to the apparatus of the camera was also self-conscious, but in a different direction. It was more a celebration, kind of joking celebration of popular cultural recognition that, oh, I'm going to be in a film now. And it was, I think, only half humorous in a way that there's self-consciousness about being represented, thinking through the means of popular media rather than through the apparatus of the organization and the ideology and practicality that the organization was making decisions about representation. So it kind of bifurcated in terms of what the apparatus provoked in these different groups.
And also at the beginning of the prison resistance, there was a lot of media like misrepresentation. So they're generally, like suspicious of any kind of both mediatic but also other forms of representation. So like at the beginning, some of them didn't even, agree to talk to me when I was first starting my fieldwork, precisely because, they're kind of doing a PhD from the US, and then also all the kind of the journalists, who were also writing pieces about the hunger strike and the dead fast, that there was some kind of like a compilation of those positions.
I'm curious, I'm actually an archaeologist, so coming from a very different perspective, but I work on issues of food, and I'm curious, this connection between food and fasting, and how explicit the people who were participating in the fast were about what counted as food and what didn't. So you mentioned that they were purposefully mixing things like salt and sugar into liquids. You also differentiated between liquid and solid, and just thinking about how widely defined that category can be by different people in different places and different times.
Yeah.
Were they explicit about what counted as food and what didn't?
Yeah. I mean, their regimen was very strict. So just water, salt, and sugar. But sugar, sometimes included candy, and they were also allowed to drink like herbal teas. But
There was also the addition of vitamin B.
The vitamin B is very interesting because after the 1996 dead fast, all these doctors from Istanbul University actually worked with the surviving hunger strikers and realized that if they were to take vitamin B1, then they were able to extend the dead fast because it was protecting the nervous system, so they were able to continue to drink water, and if you can't drink water, then you die. I mean, that's why there's like strange counting of the days, that kind of like 40s. So, but because of the vitamin B1, they could go on for like 100 days. And like these doctors also publicized this information. And the organizations, sometimes to show their determination to the state, they would declare that they were cutting the B1. But then they would, start retaking it. And but their regimens were really strict. So like no juices or anything of that sort.
I have one other unrelated question. This one is more from the sort of technical filmmaking perspective. I thought it was interesting to see you all experiment with the idea of sort of zooming in on certain parts of an image and breaking them apart and sort of pushing the viewer to see it. And then the example you gave of sort of where that idea emerged from was using like found footage, using historic imagery. And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the difference in that process when you're using something that someone else created versus when you're creating the image but then still going through that next step of kind of picking it apart and directing attention.
Well, I'll say that the footage that we obtained deliberately, we still didn't have that much control over. So certainly the outdoor scenes where we would just literally set up outside and people would pass by and we would get what we could get, sometimes near up and often from a distance, and not be able to keep people out of the frame sometimes. In a certain sense, that was found. And obviously we have more control over framing. But of course, if you're going through an archive of material, you're also choosing what elements to include and not include. And Ken Jacobs' work is so much about not just accepting what's given in the frame as this kind of inviolable whole, but kind of cutting it up in some ways. And I would say even with the interviews, we could set up a framing shot to some degree, but whatever we would ask, we couldn't control what people might say. And it was in the post-production, as with Ken Jacobs' work, where we were able to pick which 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes of their speech that we thought was of interest. So in some sense, we found within this larger body of their interviews what we chose to pull out. And so I guess the short answer is I see the foundness and the deliberateness, certainly in documentary filmmaking, as more of a continuum overlapping than different categories. And I know, certainly in a fictional feature film, I don't know, somebody like Alfred Hitchcock famously had it all mapped out ahead of time with very little variance. But we didn't have that much control over variables in how we obtained our footage.
Thank you so much for showing scenes in the film and also your talk. I was taken by the phrase, like, the state becomes specific itself, that you mentioned during your talk, and I was interested in the state becomes besides itself.
Oh, yeah.
And so I wonder if you want to speak more to that. And like how that kind of frames onto like the stakes of survival are for these, like either prison institutions or the government, and then how maybe that, and also like in the film, if that's like a focus at all in terms of turning points as time goes on, or in excavating these stories, if there are moments when that suspension that prisoners and death fasters are experiencing also kind of maps onto the state.
I don't know if, the state, if we understand it in its, extended sense is in the film. But when I use that phrase, I was kind of like precisely like emphasizing that, the death fast is not about actualization of death, but actually, keeping it as a possibility, right? Because if you're dead, you're no longer, under the control of the state, right? And you're gone. And you, most of the time, also become a martyr. And whereas if you're in the prison and if you're on the hunger strike, there is that kind of indeterminacy that the state has to deal with, and that produces much more anxiety on the part of, both the prison administrations, but also, even the higher ups. So, that's why I think I find that narrative very interesting, because the leading organization, the Revolutionary People's Party Front, which I did not address in my talk and which is not in the film, so their narrative is all about death. It's about, the kind of like the actualization of death. But what happens with that, even with that actualization, that it becomes serialized. So when there is a seriality of deaths, then it's also not completely actualized, right? It's still opening to the future through that kind of serialization. It's a way of thinking about how to exit that kind of what I'm calling after Agamben and Esposito, the biopolitical juridical dispositive. So if you're just, kind of like mimetically reversing the relations of domination, where you take or expropriate the power of life and death from the state, then it's actually, you're still, staying within that same logic. Whereas I think in this narrative, I find that, that they're proposing, and also that they're proposing this other way out, where, you're actually no longer enclosed in that vicious circle of opposition, right?
So I'll say that hearing Özge state that quote also struck me too, that, and in general, the people she consulted, her interlocutors, were clearly very engaged in theorizing what it was they were doing, and doing it not just in opposition, but to escape the ideologies as put forward, as normalized, naturalized by the government, by mainstream society itself. And this constant vying for reclaiming some kind of ideological ground is then part of what we took up as a challenge in the film part of things. And so thus our embrace of maybe greater degrees of abstraction, and that abstraction was meant to also put the hunger strikers' own ideologically charged statements into question too. That even the white kind of ghostliness is that their ideologies, there's a gap between their ideologies and maybe what we might actually experience, and that they're sort of replicating rhetoric that they've been rehearsing over and over again. So trying to put that into some question, I guess, as well. In a more literal or physical sense, that the state maybe shows, or that the constrictions of mainstream society show up in the film with a lot of us shooting like bars, like gates and fences and so forth, just commonplace things that would be part of the infrastructure of daily life, but highlighting it in some ways and casting individual portraits through the bars themselves.
Yeah, and there are also like lots of spaces of inactivity. Like how prisons are also described as spaces of idleness. I mean, especially for, political prisons, right? So that kind of idleness where the body is captured, we're trying to think about other spaces of inactivity outside the prison. And so there are a lot of shots of these coffee shops which only men visit in Turkey, where they drink coffee and smoke and watch TV. So kind of like a unemployed male population, kind of like a surplus population. So that's also, maybe the presence of the absence of the state in a certain sense.
So not to give away too much of the logic in representing the film, but the ghostly white representations, the portraits of the hunger strikers themselves, is contrasted with the lived daily life in fuller color, more naturally, realistically demonstrated. And about 2/3 of the way through the film, we shift to abandon that sort of ghostly film to allow even the hunger strikers themselves to speak more directly and fully in living drama. So that, I guess you could say, is sort of a lapse back to, if not the state, then the state of everyday life, where the sort of contest of ideologies is kind of almost over. Thanks for the question.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if you could share a bit more about how you see this sort of space of, I was hearing a lot of indeterminacy, dissolution of categories, like ontological categories like death and life, and being able to time, transcend the body, individual body, multiple bodies. The death fast kind of brings about this way of being for the participants. I was just wondering if you could speak more about how that way of being actually weighs on the state itself, and how do you see, or is taken up by people who aren't necessarily direct participants? How do you see the movement from this kind of very fertile and nascent space of experience of the impossible, right? How does that actually then permeate into places beyond the death fast would be my question.
No, that's a great question. And I think that's that's one of the failures of the prison movement, that it wasn't able to interpolate others. And so that kind of, that indeterminacy or that, open potentiality ended up with this crippled, political subject with no future gain. That's the paradox for me. Kind of when it is experienced as this pure possibility, right? That experience of death. So it's not about actually the possibility of impossibility, or that ends up with this subject which does not even remember why they were on the hunger strike. But it begins with an intentional self-starvation. So that kind of bare life comes at the end, right? You start as a political subject, and then through self-starvation you end up as this bare life. And I was trying to read the bare life as actually, as potentiality and not necessarily as mere passivity or mere victimhood. But you're absolutely right that then, how does that experience translate or does not translate across? And in the case of Turkey, it does not. And the reason why I actually am turning towards these other narratives, which actually displace the emphasis on the usurpation of the power of life and death, is that the language of the political organizations, right? It's all about sovereignty. So it ends up being, instead of like that kind of open potentiality, like we don't know where this demand will lead to, like what kind of a rupture it will create, that it end up being narrowed or confined to a claim for sovereignty with the state. And of course that kind of differential of power is already played out. So I guess I'm kind of like trying to think about the ways in which how that language of sovereignty or identity of sovereignty and death, right, which is a theological form of politics, can be displaced towards another form of politics, which is actually harbored within the experience of the dead fasters. So kind of like make a gap or open up a gap between the experience and the discourses which represent that experience, and the organizational discourses are actually the ones who made them fail, right? It's not the state, it's their own language. So of course, then there's a problem of, that kind of like the critique of organizations also so easily devolves into, a language of the state, which is also criticizing the organization, saying that, they're instrumentalizing these bodies, right? But I mean, there's some truth to that, because the experience of the hunger strikers are used, retroactively as the foundation for the authority of these organizations, right? So they can say all these people are dying, for their beliefs, for their convictions, as are members of the organization. So like all dead fasters, they don't, even though they have proper names, they always come with their organizational affiliation in the literature. So like, and I'm just going to say one last thing, and this is that kind of experience of death or experience of dying, that space, also lacks a language. Like there are all these narratives around it, but also, like I thought that R was someone who articulated that kind of experience. So it didn't kind of emerge yet as a language which can kind of stand apart from the language of the organizations and say itself differently. So I mean, that's what I'm trying to do in the ethnography. And in the film, I think in relation to your question was the exploration of the relationship between that temporality and other social temporalities, right, outside the prison. What is it to live outside the prison, and what is it to live inside the prison, and so can they actually communicate with each other? And I think the film is a kind of a hyperbolization of the non-communication, I would say.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have a question, but I will save it for the
Yeah,
screening.